how our form of government kind of fits in with that. All right. So there's going to be terms and definitions that we'll kind of repeat over the course to kind of basically kind of make sure, reiterate you're aware of. So when we talk about government, a lot of times there's terms that teachers tend to throw out that sometimes they may not be clear about here. And we last chapter we were kind of introducing the chapter, we're talking about civics, what civics was, and we also included government. So here again, you'll see this definition. You may see it again in another chapter here, but the kind of standard textbook definition of what a government is the organizations, institutions, and the people that make up those organizations, institutions, individuals who exercise political authority over a group of people. Do you guys know what authority means? Have you heard the term authority? What does authority mean? You ever heard of that term? Yeah.
Like having power over somebody?
Yeah, something like that. Like kind of having power over, and how people kind of obtain power differs based on the different types of government. All right. And again, the United States, we tend to kind of like have these ideals and values that are reflected in our form of government. And where authority comes from, all right, we tend to, we kind of like try to kind of export that at times, all right. But how people kind of obtain authority over others through government varies based on the types of government, all right. So what much of this first section talks about the different types of government and how our form of government kind of fits in with that. So the first one they start out with was what we call monarchies, probably the oldest forms of government since the dawn of civilization, right? And there's two types of monarchies that have developed over time. The oldest form of monarchy, what they refer to as an absolute monarchy. Power is held usually in a person, a monarch, a king or a queen, but it could be an emperor in past, a shah or whatever, all right? And then when they say passage of leadership or passage of power, authority, is based on heredity. What does heredity mean? Family. That family, exactly. All right. So usually in kind of the era of the era of the absolute kings, like they talk about European history, right? You have the king's idea of when the king would pass away, they would pass it on. Usually these are in history these kind of patriarchal societies. We usually pass it on to father to son. Although there have been times like in England, all right, with the passage like Queen Elizabeth and Queen Victoria and stuff like that, all right. But this is essentially a lot of times they would refer to it as the divine right of kings, all right. And so when they mean divine, that means it's divinely inspired. That generally these are people that have the kind of what separates them from everybody else is their connection to a spiritual entity, a god, if you will. All right. So in many cases, in absolute monarchies, religion and politics go hand in hand in certain cases. Now, there are still some examples of some absolute monarchies around the world. Example would be Saudi Arabia. Would be kind of an absolute monarchy. The Saud family kind of rules there. Brunei is an example. There's a guy named the Sultan of Brunei who governs a small state in Southeast Asia, but it's incredibly wealthy thanks to oil and other kind of natural gas deposits. All right, and so a number of like kind of what they call Gulf states are kind of viewed as absolute monarchies. All right, so like a prime example I was talking about, kind of like in the glory age of kind of the absolute monarchs. This is King Louis XIV, the King of France. All right, and so this kind of idea of a monarch, kind of like essentially kind of gaining power from a higher entity and then passing that power on to their family, their bloodline, is the essence of an absolute monarchy. However, there are some monarchies around today that wouldn't be classified as absolute monarchies, but as what we call constitutional monarchies. This is where the monarch, the king or queen or whatever, is what we refer to as a figurehead. Power is primarily, government power authority is mainly vested in an elected law body. All right, so like in Europe, there's a lot of countries that have constitutional monarchies where they have monarchs. Probably the most famous one would be England, right? United Kingdom. But you also the Netherlands, Spain has a monarchy, Sweden, Japan is actually probably the oldest monarchy based on heredity. They call it the Chrysanthemum throne. All right, but power is generally vested in a lawmaking body like Parliament, or in Japan they call it the Diet. All right. So this over time kind of emerged after we refer to as the Age of Enlightenment. And our revolution, the American Revolution, plays a role in this. It's kind of limiting the kind of concept of an absolute monarchy where we have more of these kind of constitutional monarchies around. All right. And then, like, for example, like with Great Britain, with the United Kingdom, they have what they call the Commonwealth of Nations, where there's countries that have, like, for example, our neighbor to the north, Canada. Canada is a part of that Commonwealth where their head of government is the Prime Minister. That's the head of the kind of lawmaking body, but their head of state is the Queen of England. All right, and they have that kind of connection to England as that. So there's like countries like Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. Some of the Caribbean countries are referred to as the Commonwealth nations. All right, so this is probably the most famous kind of constitutional monarchy. There's the Queen of England and her husband Philip II. She's in her 90s, right? And so when she dies, I think her son, who's it, Charles, is supposed to be king. There's a debate in England by this a number of people. Why have like these people? Why have these people kind of wearing these ridiculous outfits and stuff like that? Why do you think these countries have these monarchs? What do you think they represent? Like for us, it kind of seems kind of odd, right? It's this idea of tradition. In many cases, tradition, a lot of times, it's hard for people to change certain ideas. They represent this kind of connection to the past, this connection to kind of greatness of when England was great and stuff like that. All right, so a lot of those countries keep these kind of monarchs around to kind of represent their state, but they don't really have much government power. All right, this is Parliament in England. That's where the House of Commons in particular, and we'll talk about the kind of concept of bicameral legislature, that's where most of the power is vested, where the laws are made and such. All right. And then we have what we call totalitarian style of governments, authoritarian as well. All right. You have different styles. A dictatorship is essentially where we see powers usually vested in one person, all right, or a very small group of people. In a dictatorship, there's very little freedoms given to the general population. All right. Like in recent history, like a dictatorship could be like something like in North Korea would be an example of a dictatorship. We have Kim Jong-un. You have these kind of like cult of personality kind of figures, if you will. All right. And dictatorships kind of differ based on political ideology. You ever heard the term when they would talk about people like the right and left? Have you ever heard that when they talk about politics? All right. So you have totalitarian dictatorships on the right, and you do have totalitarian dictatorships on the left. All right. An example of one on the right, you would have like two kinds of oligarchy, which actually is a Greek term meaning rule by a few. There was a number of Greek city-states, like Sparta, for example. The famous Sparta was kind of classified as an oligarchy. Power is mainly vested in a small group of kind of elders, if you will. All right. A prime example today of an oligarchy would be Russia. Russia is a primary an oligarchy where we see somebody like Vladimir Putin. We see this kind of a semblance of a kind of democratic institutions like Parliament. They call it the Duma there and stuff like that. But really, his power is vested in one individual who essentially, basically, after the fall of the Soviet Union, in Russia they divided up like certain things like resources, like metals and oil and all this other stuff, where you have these few people that become incredibly wealthy, and they basically kind of like use their wealth to influence politics. All right. Some people argue, there's some people that argue that maybe the United States is an oligarchy because we have basically allowed for special interests, a lot of big money and stuff like that to kind of like donate to congressmen or senators or presidents and stuff like that. And that money talks to a certain degree. All right. But a prime example would be Russia. And then fascism, which is a kind of historically, this is a system where we see a dictatorship of the right, where there's a heavy emphasis on nationalism. And there's a heavy emphasis on race. The term actually comes from the Roman term, the fasces, which was a symbol that in the Roman politics in the Senate, that was a symbol of kind of Roman governance. All right. A guy named Benito Mussolini, who was an Italian, the first fascist dictator, harkened back to an era when Italy was kind of great on the Roman Empire. All right. And he influences this dude on the right. So they see Mussolini on the left, Hitler on the right. All right. So Nazism is a form of fascism. All right. Unfortunately, the people that stormed the Capitol just last week had some kind of fascist tendencies to them. All right. They are kind of invested in a kind of cult of personality kind of thing. All right. And so you see a heavy emphasis traditionally in fascism where we see like kind of military, the leader wearing military garb. All right, this idea of kind of like strength and power are kind of associated with one another. That's a form of a dictatorship. On the left, you have communism, all right, as a kind of a form of totalitarianism historically. This is usually where we see the one thing that kind of separates kind of communism from fascism is in economics. All right, in a strict communist kind of form of government, the government owns all means of production. All right, there is no real concept of kind of private ownership and stuff like that. Now, some things have changed over time, but an example of kind of communist governments that are still around today, North Korea, which is probably a truer version of that. China is still technically a communist country. However, economically, since the late 70s, they've allowed for more private ownership of business. All right, this was a style of government that was developed by a guy named Karl Marx in the 1800s. It was a reaction to kind of hyper-capitalism that was occurring in Europe. All right. Does anybody know it was the first country that ever became a communist country? It's no longer communist. I mentioned it as an oligarchy today. Russia. Yeah, Russia was known as the Soviet Union. All right. The problem was, as far as somebody like Karl Marx, who came up with this idea, he believed that you had to be industrialized as an economy, that the workers will rise up, the proletariat, and they'll take over the kind of means of production, stuff like that. Problem was that it happened in Russia in 1917, 1918, and the deal was that Russia was primarily agrarian, still a farming community. Then you have a bunch of, like Cuba, just south of us, is a communist country. All right, so you still have communist countries around today, but unfortunately, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of those countries, for them, they've had to kind of adjust economically to a certain extent, because for a long period of time, the Soviet Union was essentially funding a lot of these countries. And then you have what we call a theocracy. This is basically a government based on religious affiliation. All right. Like a prime example of theocracy would also be Saudi Arabia, Iran, Afghanistan, but Vatican City is a form of theocracy. A lot of early monarchies were tied in with religion and theocracies. All right, so this is what they call communist, this kind of communist form of art, where you see here's Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, who are considered the founders of that. There's a big heavy of it, like Lenin and Stalin, particularly with Stalin, there's that emphasis of kind of like a cult of personality. North Korea is more like a Stalinist communist country with Kim Jong-un, all right? And so you see this kind of, the idea of like the workers, everybody's supposed to be like kind of equal in that sense. However, power corrupts absolutely, as they say, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So unfortunately, the communist kind of ideal was never very fully kind of like formed. We would have a communist party that was controlling things and was almost like kind of like basically a police state at certain times. And this is Iran. After the revolution in 1979 was established, the Islamic Republic of Iran. All right. So these are kind of totalitarian style governments that tend to be at times on the left. Theocracy could be on the left and the right, if you will. All right. And then the types of government that we tend to kind of like focus on in this class here is democratic democracies. Like with oligarchy, democracy was essentially established during ancient Greece. All right. In a democracy, you basically have either people rule directly or they basically elect officials on their behalf. The first kind of like was classified as the first democracy established in ancient Greece was Athens. Athens had an example of what we refer to as a direct democracy. All right. So the kind of the council that they had there basically made decisions that directly impacted them. All right. It was limited though in the concept of citizenship. All right, citizenship was limited to only a small group of male voters, free men. All right. So an example of direct democracy, well, let's say like we had a vote here. Let's say let's take notes or let's go to sleep. So we all raise our hand. There would be like one of us that would basically vote to take notes. The rest of us would vote to go to sleep. We'd all take a nap. All right. That we would directly impact ourselves. All right. Our decisions would directly impact. In small communities, you can have this. All right. But in a larger setting, like in a city, county, state, or kind of federal government, it's improbable to have a direct democracy. What the type of democracy we tend to focus on in this class, what we would call the representative democracy or a republic. Representative democracy, this is more, we have our form of democracy really is more a form of the Roman tradition rather than the Athenian one. But a representative democracy, you elect people. All right, they carry out the work for you. A lot of us don't have time to deal with governing. So we pick people, every 2-4 years, whatever the case may be, we vote people to kind of do the job of governing for us. All right. Those that kind of like those types of governments are often referred to as republics. all right, where the people consent to rule. Now you have in certain cases, like in North Korea, they have elections, all right, but it's usually 99% of the population, they'll say, like, voted for Kim Jong-un. They're not real elections, all right? They're a facade. So a lot of times these countries would say they're the republic or something, and it's not really fully kind of formed as a republic. All right. Now, what's the one thing that say we don't like the people that govern for us? What's the idea that how we can kind of change that? That's through what?
Apparently, it's to throw impeachments at everybody.
Not necessarily throw impeachments at everybody. I mean, and then previously it was to basically storm a capital. But in the ideal, like, you know what I'm saying? Ideally in republics, it's through elections.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's through elections. All right, and that's the idea. So in larger settings, representative democracy is basically you vote. Right? That's the idea behind it. All right, and again, these are, you know, I mean, it's ideals that we we tend to talk a lot about here. All right. And so in many cases, kind of like these are often referred to as republics. All right. And then the last thing here, which is kind of in the section here, is what's the purpose of government? Mainly purpose of like good governance, if you will. All right. So in certain cases here, helping people cooperate. Governments are one of the kind of the 6 aspects of civilizations that when we see the first civilization, similar developed people tend to basically kind of, as they organize, they also try to cooperate with one another. So governing is this thing where you basically try to make sense out of chaos to a certain extent. That's the idea. Providing services. Those services can range from everything from protection, like we have a military, like, you know, on the federal level, to essentially like on the local level, schools. All right, this is a service that's provided to you. All right. Now, generally, how are services usually funded? Where we all kind of have to kind of pool our resources in. Taxes. Okay. All right, Joe. Providing laws. Again, the same thing. The idea of kind of creating parameters and what you can and cannot do in societies. All right. A lot of times, laws, in particular in this course, laws are usually written out in what we call a constitution, a written plan of government. In certain local cases, like in cities and stuff like that, you have charters. All right. And then with our form of government, the idea of trying to guarantee freedom. All right. We were in the United States, and we'll talk about the history of kind of like as we got to our form of government. That's a big emphasis on freedom and liberty and stuff like that. All right. We were often referred to as an experiment in governance. What we were doing was something that hasn't probably been done since the time of the Renaissance in like certain small republics in Italy and stuff like that. All right. So let's see, what time we got on there? 19. Okay, so about a minute here. Check on your on Google Classroom. I had a 820 assigned a kind of a review on basically the types of government. It's a PDF, so just basically open up a Google Doc. It's basically you know, on there's like 4 types of government. They're actually kind of asking you to kind of compare and contrast. All right. So if you could just like kind of open up the PDF and then open up a separate Google Doc, answer those questions, and then send it back to me, and that'll be worth 20 points. All right. So it should. Did it come to you yet?
Which one?
The new assignment. It's types of government. No, not yet. Okay. It may take a minute. All right, guys. There should be assignment coming to you here. I posted it for 8:20 on Google Classroom. Just kind of reviewing the types of government. So when you open up the PDF, open up another Google Doc to answer the questions and then submit them back to me. Sound good? I just sent it back here, so it should still. The test score should be in. So if you want to check Google Classroom.